The gym was quiet, save for the hum of the overhead lights and the faint sound of my own breath, shaky and uneven. It had been a long, grueling practice, one of those sessions that drained you physically, but left you with a strange kind of energy buzzing beneath your skin. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, eyes catching the clock on the wall, realizing the night was slipping away faster than I'd hoped. But something about tonight felt different. Something was about to shift. I could feel the tension building in the air, thick and tangible. And it wasn't just the exhaustion from practice.
It was him. Coach Callahan.
He had a way of looking at you, of making everything feel charged, even when he wasn't saying a word. Maybe it was the way his eyes lingered just a bit longer than necessary when he corrected my form, or the way his voice softened when he praised me. It was subtle, but I couldn't help but notice it. Maybe I was imagining things, or maybe I wasn't. But tonight, after practice, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that could change everything. I grabbed my water bottle, taking a long sip, my fingers trembling ever so slightly as I tried to steady myself. The gym, with its empty bleachers and echoes of earlier chaos, felt oddly intimate now. Alone. Like it was just me and him left. And then, as I set my bottle down, I heard him call my name. "Hey Blake," Coach's voice rang out, sharp but warm. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively turned to face him. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his usual confident stance softened by something else in his posture. Something I couldn't quite read. "Yeah," I replied, my voice betraying a hint of uncertainty, even though I had no idea why. "I need you to stick around for a bit. Got something I want to talk to you about," he said, his eyes locking with mine for a fraction of a second longer than usual. That moment, the way his gaze held mine, the calm in his voice, it was enough to send a wave of uncertainty rushing over me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but it felt like I was missing something. A piece of the puzzle I couldn't quite place. The gym was no longer just a space to train, it had become something else. And in that quiet moment, as I walked over to where he stood, I couldn't shake the thought that tonight was going to change everything. Coach Callahan and I had been working together for a while now, long enough for me to get used to his presence, his no-nonsense attitude, and the way he seemed to always know when I was holding back. But what I hadn't anticipated was how much he'd come to mean to me. It wasn't just the coaching, the drills, the endless routines that pushed me harder than I thought I could go. It was the moments between the exercises, the quiet exchanges when everyone else had left the gym, when the weight of the world seemed a little bit lighter in his company. Our relationship had started like any other between a coach and an athlete, professional, distant, focused on the work at hand. I was just another player in a team of faces, another name he had to remember among dozens of others. But something about Coach Callahan made him stand out. Maybe it was his calm, measured way of giving advice, or the way his voice was always steady even when everything else around us felt chaotic. Or maybe it was the way he seemed to always know exactly how to read me, to push me just a little further than I thought I could go. I'd noticed it first during the early practices. I was struggling with a particularly challenging drill. My coordination wasn't the best, and I felt like I was always just a step behind the others. Most coaches would have just shouted instructions or given some quick feedback, but not Coach Callahan. He took the time to come over to me, slowing everything down. His hand would lightly rest on my shoulder, a small but comforting gesture, as he explained what I was missing. "Focus on your core," he'd say. "Get your balance first, then everything else falls into place." His hands would guide mine, moving slowly as if teaching me a dance I hadn't quite mastered yet. I could feel the warmth of his touch through my workout gear, the brief but meaningful connection as he adjusted my posture. I'd always nod, trying to hold it together, but inside something would stir. Something I couldn't name, something that was beginning to gnaw at me. When practice ended, it was always the same routine. Everyone else would filter out, talking and laughing, buzzing with a kind of energy you only get from pushing yourself to the limit. But Coach Callahan and I would often be left alone in the gym. He'd go over the session, offering feedback, and I'd listen, trying to absorb everything he said. We'd talk about strategy or about the team's performance, but over time, those moments became something more. There was a quiet intimacy in them, a space where we were more than just coach and athlete. I found myself looking forward to those quiet moments after practice. It wasn't just about the drills anymore, it was about the conversations, the way we started to build a rhythm between us. I'd find myself sitting on the bleachers, waiting for him to finish talking to the others, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. It wasn't obvious, not to anyone else. But to me, it was undeniable. I remember the first time we stayed late after practice to talk about something other than the usual drills. It was a cool autumn evening, and the gym lights cast long shadows on the floor as we sat on the sidelines, just the two of us. He'd noticed I'd been quieter than usual, withdrawn, and had asked me if everything was okay. "Hey Blake, you've been a little off today," Coach had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Something on your mind?" I remember feeling the weight of his concern, his eyes searching mine for something deeper than just a tired player. There was a vulnerability in the way he asked, and I suddenly found myself unable to hide behind the usual walls I'd built. "I guess just a lot of things," I replied, staring down at my sneakers, unsure if I was ready to open up. But he didn't rush me. He just sat there, still and patient, waiting for me to say more. "It's not easy, being in a new place," I continued, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "It's like everyone expects me to just fit in, but sometimes I don't. I don't always feel like I belong, you know?" Coach Callahan nodded, his expression softening. "I get that," he said quietly, his voice low. "Starting out can be tough. You're not just finding your place on the team, you're finding your place in everything else too. But that doesn't mean you won't find it." There was something in the way he said that last part. A reassurance, an understanding that went beyond the surface level. It wasn't just coach speak, it was a moment of raw honesty, and I felt a sense of comfort in it. It felt like he truly saw me, not just the player, but the person behind the jersey. From that moment on, things shifted. It was subtle at first. A glance here, a quiet moment there. But it was as if the air between us had changed, becoming thicker with something unspoken. Our conversations began to carry a weight that wasn't there before. We started sharing more than just the technical aspects of the game. There were moments when we'd talk about our lives outside the gym. Family, friendships, struggles, dreams. In those moments, I found myself looking at him differently, not just as a coach, but as someone I admired in ways I hadn't realized before. There was a quiet strength in him, a calm that I gravitated toward. I'd catch myself studying his expressions, the way his jaw tightened when he was concentrating, or how his eyes seemed to soften when he smiled. But it wasn't just his looks, it was the way he made me feel. He made me feel like I was more than just a kid trying to prove myself. He made me feel like I mattered. And that feeling was dangerous. It was a slow burn, a spark I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried to push it away. One afternoon, after an especially grueling practice, Coach caught me lingering in the locker room, stuffing my things into my gym bag. He didn't say much at first, just leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that familiar intensity. "Blake," he started, his voice low but direct. "You're doing good. You've got potential. I see it." I paused, surprised by the sincerity in his words. I'd heard those words before from other coaches, but something about the way Coach said it made me feel like I was finally seen for who I was, more than just an athlete trying to fit in. "Thanks, Coach," I muttered, my heart pounding a little faster than I'd like to admit. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary before he turned and walked away. That simple gesture, a fleeting glance, a compliment, carried more weight than I could have imagined. And it was in that moment, standing in the quiet locker room, that I realized how much I had come to rely on him. Not just for guidance in the gym, but for something deeper. Something I couldn't quite put into words. We were crossing lines I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. The shift didn't happen all at once. It wasn't some dramatic moment where the sky parted and everything became clear. No, it crept in, slow and unnoticed at first, like the faintest whisper that gradually grew louder until I could no longer ignore it. I was becoming acutely aware of things I'd never noticed before. The way Coach Callahan's presence seemed to fill the room, how he always seemed to know when I needed a break before I even did. His calm, commanding voice had become a comfort, a constant I began to rely on, even when practice had ended. There were moments when I'd catch myself watching him more closely than I should, noticing the way his hand moved when he demonstrated a technique, how his fingers brushed his hair back when it fell into his eyes. I would feel a flutter in my chest, a strange tightness in my throat, and I'd quickly look away, hoping nobody noticed. But nobody else seemed to pick up on it. The team was too focused on the next drill, the next game, the next victory. They didn't see what I saw, the small unspoken moments between us that lingered just a bit too long. They didn't see how, after practice, when the gym had emptied out and it was just the two of us again, there was a kind of stillness between us, charged with something unspoken. Coach had started lingering longer after practice, too. It was subtle at first. He'd ask me about my day, about my progress with the drills, as if it was just a natural part of his coaching style. But the way he'd stand just a little too close when he corrected my posture, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, it felt different.
I felt different.
One evening, after a particularly brutal session, he asked me to stay behind for an extra set of exercises. It wasn't uncommon for him to do that with athletes he thought had potential, but this time, something felt off. He was quiet, his usual confidence replaced with a gentle, almost cautious approach as he instructed me on my form. I couldn't tell if it was just me, but the way he kept looking at me seemed more intense than usual. His gaze would linger on my face, my hands, my movements, as if he was studying me in a way I didn't quite understand. "Keep your shoulders back," Coach said, standing behind me, his hands hovering near my back. His voice was low, deliberate, and when his fingers brushed against the fabric of my shirt, I felt a spark race through my body. It was nothing major, just a touch, but it made everything inside me pulse, like the breath in my lungs had been stolen for a second. I glanced over my shoulder, locking eyes with him for a moment longer than necessary. My heart thudded in my chest, and I quickly looked away, feeling a flush of heat spread across my face. Was it me, or had something shifted in that brief look? Was I imagining it? "Better," Coach said, his voice soft but approving. But there was something more in the tone, something that made the air feel thick, heavy, as if he was holding back something, just as I was. After that day, I started noticing the subtle signs more and more. The accidental brushes of his hand against mine, the way his voice would catch ever so slightly when he gave me praise, as if he were searching for something else in my response.
And I couldn't ignore it anymore.
The connection between us wasn't just about being coach and athlete, it was something else, something that I had no idea how to categorize. The way I felt around him, how he made me feel like I was the only person in the room, was intoxicating. It was more than just admiration or respect. It was the way he understood me in ways I couldn't even explain.
When I was with him, I felt seen. I felt heard.
And for someone who had always struggled to make those connections with others, it was powerful. There were moments when it was almost unbearable, like when I was sitting on the bleachers after practice, staring at the floor, avoiding eye contact because I didn't know if I could handle what I might see in his eyes. There was this pull, this magnetic tension between us that felt as if it might snap at any second, and yet every time it seemed to reach its breaking point, he would pull back, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling, but couldn't allow it to go any further. The internal conflict was overwhelming. I wasn't sure what I was feeling, whether it was admiration, something deeper, or just the need for approval. And I was scared. Scared of what those feelings might mean. Scared of how this would change things between us. If I allowed myself to explore these feelings, what would happen? Would it destroy everything? One afternoon, after practice, we were sitting in the empty locker room, catching our breath. It had been a rough practice, and I could feel the exhaustion settling in, my body sore and aching, but there was something else lingering. The gym felt quieter, as if the world outside had faded away. It was just me and Coach. He leaned against the lockers, his arms crossed, looking at me with a quiet intensity. "You've been pushing yourself harder lately," he remarked, his gaze scanning my face, as though reading something in my expression. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was for the right reasons. I didn't just want to prove myself on the court anymore, I wanted to prove something to him. "You've got potential, Blake," Coach continued, his tone filled with an unspoken weight. "But you need to trust yourself. Trust me. You can't keep holding back." It was like a light switch had been flipped. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and thick. I didn't know why, but that moment, the way he said those words, the way he looked at me, felt like the moment everything had changed. I didn't know how to respond. All I could do was nod again, swallowing the lump in my throat. I wanted to say something, anything, but I was terrified of what would happen if I did. So I sat in silence, feeling the tension between us stretch further, until the words I'd been holding back felt like they might choke me. That night as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him.
About us.
It was like my mind was racing 100 miles an hour, and I couldn't catch up. The way his voice sounded when he said my name. The way his eyes searched mine, always looking for something more. I wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, my feelings for Coach Callahan had shifted. They had become something more. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to confront.
And I was afraid.
Afraid of what might happen if I let those feelings show. Would it ruin everything? Would he even feel the same way? Or was it just me, projecting something that wasn't really there? All I knew was that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed. Something was different.
And it terrified me.
It happened that night, after one of the most intense practices I'd ever had, when I thought my body couldn't take another round of drills. The gym was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the exhaustion of 100 different muscles still fighting for breath. Everyone had filtered out, the echoes of their footsteps fading into the distance. The only sound left was the rhythmic thumping of my heart in my chest, pounding faster with every step I took toward the locker room. But Coach Callahan had asked me to stay behind, just like he had the night before, and the night before that. I knew it was coming. Something in the way he'd looked at me during practice, something in his tone, told me that tonight, things were going to change. My heart skipped a beat, a tight knot forming in my stomach as I lingered by the bench, unsure if I was ready for whatever came next. He was there, waiting for me by the edge of the court, his figure half-shadowed in the low light, as if he were just as uncertain about what was about to unfold. When our eyes met, there was no mistaking the look on his face. His expression was soft but intense. He was waiting for something. Waiting for me to make the next move. "Blake," Coach said, his voice low and steady, but with a trace of vulnerability that I hadn't heard before. It was like his usual confidence had been replaced with something softer, something that hinted at the walls between us finally crumbling. I swallowed, trying to gather my thoughts, but everything inside me felt scrambled, out of control. "Yeah, Coach. You've been distant lately," he said, his tone almost like a confession. "And I don't know if it's something I've done, but I can feel it. I've noticed you holding back." I froze. The words hit me harder than I expected, like a punch to the gut. He could feel it. He knew. I began, then stopped, not knowing how to finish the sentence. There were so many things I wanted to say, but none of them felt right. Instead, I found myself staring at the floor, afraid to look up, afraid to meet his gaze for fear of what might be in it. Coach took a step closer, closing the distance between us. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in with an unspoken gravity that made it hard to breathe. "Blake," he repeated, softer this time. "You're not the only one feeling this. I can't ignore what's between us." I looked up at him then, eyes wide, my pulse racing. His words hung in the air like a confession, like something forbidden. My chest tightened, a wave of emotion washing over me. There was no denying it anymore. The tension, the quiet moments we shared after practice, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long, all of it had been building toward this point. I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. The truth felt like it was suffocating me. The part of me that had been trying to suppress what I felt, trying to keep things professional, was slipping away, piece by piece. But now, standing in front of Coach, there was nowhere to hide. His gaze softened, his hand coming to rest on the small of my back, just above my waistband. It wasn't a professional touch, it was personal, intimate. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said gently. "But I need to know that you're not going to keep pushing me away. Not when we both know what's happening between us." I wanted to pull back. I wanted to take a step away from him and distance myself from everything that was happening. But something in his voice, something in the way his hand rested on my back, made it impossible to move. The world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a decision. I don't know what this is, Coach," I finally said, the words spilling out in a rush. "But I can't stop thinking about it. About you." His hand tightened just slightly, but not enough to hurt. Just enough to make me feel like he was grounding me, holding me steady. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart race even faster. "You're not the only one," Coach said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried to ignore it, Blake. I've tried to convince myself that it was just the coach in me, just me wanting to help you succeed. But I can't lie to myself anymore. What I'm feeling, it's more than that. The words felt like a weight lifted off my chest, but at the same time, the air between us thickened with the rawness of what was happening. This wasn't just some fleeting attraction.
It was real.
And it scared the hell out of me. I started, but the words caught in my throat again. What do we do now? Coach stepped closer, his breath warm against my cheek. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached up and gently cupped my jaw, his thumb brushing across the line of my jawbone, like he was memorizing the feel of my skin. His touch sent a shiver down my spine. "Don't be scared," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm not going anywhere." And just like that, I felt it, the flood of relief, the quiet assurance that somehow, everything was going to be okay, even though I had no idea where this path would lead. We were both walking in uncharted territory, and neither of us knew the destination. But the desire, the connection between us, was undeniable. Without thinking, I leaned in, just a little, barely an inch, but it was enough. Our faces were so close now, our breaths mingling, the space between us charged with everything we hadn't said before. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the hesitation, but also something else, something that said he was just as afraid as I was. "Blake," Coach whispered, his voice trembling slightly.
"Are you sure?"
I nodded, the answer coming easier than I expected.
"Yeah. I'm sure."
And then, the distance that had been between us, the tension we'd both been avoiding, shattered. His lips found mine, tentative at first, as if he were waiting for me to pull away.
But I didn't.
Instead, I kissed him back, slowly at first, like I was testing the waters, unsure of what would happen next. But the moment his lips moved against mine, I knew. There was no turning back. The kiss deepened, both of us forgetting the world around us. All I could focus on was the feel of his body against mine, the warmth of his skin, the way his hands gripped me like I was the only thing keeping him grounded. The tension we'd been dancing around for so long finally broke, and in its place was something else, something raw, something real. When we finally pulled away, gasping for breath, our foreheads pressed together, the silence between us was filled with so much unspoken emotion that I couldn't find the words to express it. But I didn't need to. The connection was there, stronger than anything I'd ever felt before. "I don't know where this is going," I said, my voice shaky, but filled with conviction. "Neither do I," Coach replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But I'm willing to find out." And in that moment, I knew that everything had changed. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. Because whatever came next, I knew we would face it together. The weeks that followed the night Coach Callahan and I crossed that line were a blur of confusion, longing, and unexpected moments of clarity. We were walking a fine line between what was allowed and what wasn't, caught between the pressure of our roles, the coach and the player, and the undeniable pull that had developed between us. The fear of being discovered, of everything crashing down, hovered over us like a storm cloud.
But we couldn't stop.
We couldn't ignore what had begun to change between us, no matter how much we tried.
At first, everything felt heightened.
Every touch was electric, every shared glance fraught with meaning. Our practices became more intense, the quiet moments after even more loaded, as if we were trying to keep everything under the surface, but barely managing to hold it all in. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me when he thought I wasn't looking. He didn't have to say a word. The way he would stand a little too close, or the way his voice would soften when he gave me instructions, made my heart race in ways it never had before. But we both knew the reality. We couldn't keep pretending that this was something that could remain in the shadows forever. The fear of being discovered, of this forbidden thing we were building together, was never far from my mind. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just a phase. That maybe it was just the intensity of the season, or the pressure of the games, or something else that would eventually fade. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I felt for him wasn't just a momentary lapse.
It was real. It was undeniable.
And then came the day when it couldn't be avoided any longer. It was an ordinary Thursday after practice, when Coach called me into his office. The way he said my name, the urgency in his voice, made my stomach flip. I knew this was it, the moment we had been dreading, the moment that would decide everything. I walked into his office, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to expect. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and we were alone. I could feel the weight of the world in that room, the tension thick in the air, like something was about to break. "Blake," Coach began, his voice steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "We need to talk." I nodded, my throat dry, the words stuck behind my teeth. I couldn't speak. What could I say? "I know what's been happening," Coach continued, his gaze not meeting mine. "I know what we've been doing. And I know it's not something we can keep ignoring." His words hit me like a punch to the stomach, but in a way, I had been expecting it. I had known deep down that we couldn't keep this a secret forever. The consequences were too high. The risk of everything falling apart, the team, my scholarship, everything I had worked for, was too great. "Coach, I started, but he held up a hand silencing me. "No, Blake," he said, his voice softer now, more vulnerable. "I'm not blaming you. I'm not saying we made a mistake. But I'm also not naive. We can't keep pretending this is just between us. People are starting to notice. And if we're not careful, everything we've built here, everything you've worked for, could come crashing down." The words stung, not because they weren't true, but because I had already known this. I had already known that this could ruin everything. The guilt, the fear, the pressure had been weighing on me for weeks, and now, it was finally out in the open. "I don't want to lose everything," I confessed, my voice shaking with the weight of my own emotions. "I don't want to lose the team or my future, or the game I love because of this." Coach looked at me then, his expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between us, thick and suffocating. And then he sighed, running a hand through his hair, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't want that either," he said softly. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your future. What we've done, it's not something I take lightly. But I care about you, Blake. I care about you more than I probably should." I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same conflict that had been tearing me apart for weeks. We had crossed a line, and there was no going back. But we were still stuck in the middle of it, unsure of what would happen next. "Then what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Coach took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the window as if searching for an answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know what comes next. But I do know that we can't keep pretending this isn't real. We have to make a decision. And whatever that decision is, we need to own it." I felt my heart race again, but this time, there was a different kind of clarity. It wasn't about what might happen next, or the consequences of our actions. It was about owning what we had started, what we had built, despite everything. Because in that moment, I realized something that I had been too afraid to acknowledge before. I didn't want to lose him. I didn't want to lose what we had. "We don't have to figure it out today," I said, my voice steady now, with a newfound determination. "But I'm not going to walk away from this. From you. Not now. Not when I've already come this far." Coach met my eyes then, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Neither am I," he replied, his voice warm. "But we have to be careful. We have to make sure we're doing this for the right reasons, not just because it's what we want in the moment." The reality of it all still weighed on me. The consequences were real. The risks were high. But I was starting to understand that this wasn't just about us. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be ignored. It was about learning to accept who we were, together, and figuring out how to navigate the world that didn't always understand that. "I don't know what happens next, Coach," I said quietly, standing up from my chair, feeling more grounded than I had in weeks. "But I know we can't hide from this anymore. We'll figure it out. Together." Coach didn't answer immediately, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes, the mixture of uncertainty and hope, told me everything I needed to know. We were still standing on the edge of something new, something fragile. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of falling. As I walked out of his office that night, the world felt a little less heavy. There were still so many questions, so much uncertainty about what would come next. But the one thing I knew for sure was that whatever happened, we would face it together. No matter the outcome. And that somehow was enough.